Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live stream. In this chat, I'd like to talk about property scams and employment scams and worker immigration scams, and it sort of all rolls into really one bigger story. Now, what kicked this off in particular was the news about the Pandoras box revelations, where it's alleged thousands of documents have been discovered about the rich people of the world, the money they keep in tax havens, and how they use a series of shell companies to move money around, and particularly buying real estate in the West. And Australia has been a big target for the big international money laundering scams of the world, coming in and buying swathes of real estate all across the country. And it's not simply the Chinese, or the Chinese are certainly very big players in this game, but it's also folks from the subcontinent and so on, or even African tin pot dictators, ripping off all that AI, using it to fabulously enrich themselves in international property, and various, especially in tyrannical regimes, various leaders that are politicians that are buying luxury waterfront apartments in the south of France to install their hot teenage mistress and that sort of thing. That's running rampant as well. But I think that'll exist for all time. But looking at the big money laundering scams and the big employment scams is more the focus of this essay. So the way it basically works is the various corrupt politicians or their goons and cronies that are close to them acquire vast sums of money through various forms of corruption and bribery and so on, and then they move that money around internationally into various places like the Cayman Islands, which is a known tax haven, but also into quite legitimate areas where they'll create what's known as a shell company. That is, they register a company and it's got nothing in it, has no value, it owns nothing, and then they'll move millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, whatever, into that company. That company will then buy something somewhere else, which will then be sold, and then that money moved to another location, and so on. So they can bounce money around the world, and big lumps of it, very quickly and very easily through the shell companies and buying and selling of assets. And typically they do a round robin where they're involved with a cluster of other organisations or companies, or they're aided and facilitated by the big financial institutions, and they're able to sell what they buy for vast sums of money, far above market prices. So there's a lot of price rigging and all sorts of feather bedding that goes on here as the money moves around. So there's and these people can get very rich by doing this, and typically these people are already quite well to do. So why they have to engage in this when they're already rich is maybe a little harder to understand. But look, if you can never be rich enough in the view of these people, particularly given that their money is illicit. They haven't made it legitimately or honestly or legally. They've effectively stolen and grafted and parasited off their own citizens to get this money. And so they've always got this dread and fear that one day they'll be found out and discovered, and if the government changes hands or the attitudes change, then suddenly what was acceptable behaviour yesterday may be outrageous corruption the next day. So these are so they always like to have a good spread of real estate around the world, so they can escape at short notice and go to their luxury mansion wherever. So this corruption is very widespread, and just looking at some of the few examples that have come out of it. Some of these. These people are buying buildings and office buildings and apartment blocks for like $100 or $200 million, and then they're magically able to sell it for $400 million or 12 months later, and so on. So clearly the scams are vast, and some of these people are buying property, say in Sydney, where they're buying their property portfolio's got more than 100 or 200, even 300 freestanding properties in residential properties in the portfolio, and worth hundreds of millions, many hundreds of millions of dollars. So these sort of things really subvert the market forces in the local real estate market and make it impossible for. I mean, just in Sydney alone, you have to be in terms of income, at least the wealthiest 5% of income earners. And there needs to be two of you even at the bottom end of that to be able to afford even an average price of a house. So it just goes to show how many people have fallen below the line where they can even dream of affording a basic property, let alone something in a desirable location. But the other side of this same thing, once this money starts moving around, you've got situations now where offshore investors are buying up franchises for things like pharmacies and chemists, postal delivery services, takeout food franchises, you name it. If there's a franchise out there for sale, these people are buying it. So they'll get the money offshore, they'll round robin it through various shell companies, move the money, then buy up the franchise in, for example, Australia. And it could be a national franchise or whatever, but particularly they hang around with things like the postal services type stuff, courier companies, labour hire firms, pharmacies that I mentioned, organisations that deliver accounting services, all that sort of stuff. So pharmacies that I mentioned, organisations that deliver accounting services, all that sort of stuff. So they buy into these franchises with offshore money, and they make sure they charge management fees from the offshore location, which means no profits are ever made in the local market, in this case Australia, which means they never pay taxes. So it's massive. They then place adverts in the local online employment job boards, and they just pretend that they don't get any applications. So they need to only run this advert for 6 weeks or so a few $100. And then they can say, well, we can't find anyone to do this. And they can easily, effortlessly get a sign off to then start bringing in low wage peasants from the third world country that the money came from. So they can bring out masses of Indians, for example, or rural Chinese and peasants from anywhere, for goodness sakes, and they bring them out. Typically, the Chinese and Indians are the ones involved in this scams the most. But they'll buy these, and then they'll bring all these people out to work in them. But they'll then avoid tax again, because they'll package their salary or their income or their pay with accommodation and food. Now, the accommodation is buildings owned by these investors, these offshore investors. The restaurants or the food companies that supply the food, they're also owned there and also populated by people that have been brought in because they pretend they can't find anyone locally and that are paid shit money. They get their food and accommodation, so they're always paid under the tax paying threshold. So no taxes are paid again there. And it just goes on and on and on. So the scam of moving money around, tax avoidance, all sorts of offshore management fee scams and the like. It all rolls into the same package of the real estate and the employment scams and the money laundering and the tax avoidance and so on and so forth. But they come with that intent. That's the whole purpose of buying up these businesses, is to own them and artificially undercut employment rates. To not be subject to any market forces, whether it be with real estate pricing or the employment salaries and wages and wage rates and so on. They're bypassing all of that or subverting it, I would argue. So that's what's going on there. But it's not so much that it's a case here, a case there. It's the scale of it. The scale of it is huge, and it's materially altering. The West is being changed into a third world shithole that these people are coming from. The lawlessness and the scams and the corruption and the kickbacks. They're importing every one of their bad habits into the West and subverting the West. Now, one of the things that makes the West rich is the fact that we've got market forces that were at least used to be used to be very minimal corruption, or that it was at such a high level, the very apex of the apex, that it really didn't touch anything down below, or hardly anything. Now all this is being lost. We're frittering away all these things and just turning ourselves, the West is away, or ignore it, or even aid and abet it. That's my take on things. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.